Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank Teresa for inviting me today and for picking the topic. It is an interesting topic, and I will tell you that I was surprised, and we had some communication earlier on about the fact that there is no research on female relationships, really. There are books, for example, Teresa showed me this one, which actually was very good. I wish I would have found that before this talk. There are some books on friendships, but they don't really necessarily deal with female relationships. There are a lot of books on mother-daughter relationships, but there isn't a whole lot on female relationships, which I thought was interesting in and of itself. So the things that we do know from the research is that women are relational people. We tend to understand ourselves, to figure out our problems as we talk with somebody else. So when you're talking with somebody, you tend to figure things out by yourself. Men are completely different. They will work a problem in their head, and the thing that they verbalize is the bottom line. And so that makes us really different. You may notice that in your marriages where they'll try and fix it, and you just say, no, really? Just listen, because I'll work it out as I get there, as I talk about it. Research also tells us that social people who are more social, tend to endorse being happier. They also live longer. So social people who are more relational, tend to be happier in their lives day to day. So those are the things basically that we know about relationships, according to the research. But as we all know, being women on this planet, female relationships are important to us. We figure out ourselves in the context of those relationships. However, they can be tricky. All of us have had a difficult friendship. All of us have been burned by someone or hurt by someone. And so those relationships can be very tricky. Why they're tricky, we don't know. And so I surmise that there's many different factors that go into why it is. Can you hear me, by the way? Yep. Okay, good. There's a lot of different factors that go into why these relationships are tricky, and I'll touch on a few of those. But let me start with us as individuals. Developmentally, we all grow up very different, but very much the same. We all pass the milestones as our kids do. We all learn to walk. We all learn to talk. We all learn to feed ourselves, and we all learn to interact with others. And we pass those milestones. Those are the things that we all do. But we also grow up very differently. And if you grow up in a house of all brothers, you're going to see the world differently than if you grow up with all sisters, if you grow up as an only child, or in a large family. We tend to view the world based on what we know in our environment. As we grow, we take in the world around us. We see the world differently, and we learn from our environment. Our first substantial relationship, and how we learn about relationships initially, is the relationship that we have with our parents. Sometimes our personality meshes with our parents, and it becomes a relatively easy relationship. Sometimes, through no fault of theirs or no fault of ours, our personalities don't necessarily line up, and so we are at odds with each other, and we learn maybe what it's like to be in a difficult relationship. And it's surmised that people who grow up in difficult relationships with their parents can tolerate difficult relationships in their marriages and in their friendships, whereas people who don't learn to tolerate some of those difficulties need a much calmer relationship in order to survive. So the combination then of both what we learn in our environment, what we learn from our parents, what we learn from our siblings, and our temperament, and I've talked about this before when I talk about parenting, is we're all born with a certain temperament. And it's that old struggle between nature and nurture. And the nurture is what we learn in our environment, and the nature is what we're born with. We are born with a certain personality or a certain temperament, and that temperament either makes us a very kind of laid-back person or makes us a very high-stress person. We inherit some of that, and we have to learn to manage that temperament along with what we learn in our environment. Generally, women also, in their relationships and in their environment, take in a whole lot more emotion than our male counterparts. And so we feel emotions a whole lot stronger, and we understand situations based on emotion primarily. And that's different than when I talk about this, I talk in generalities. Men in general, you're going to find that incredibly emotional man also, but in general, women take in situations a whole lot more emotionally than a man would. How we learn to cope with our emotions, how we learn to express them if we do, or do we avoid them, or do we share them, how we understand them, how we manage them becomes part of who we are, and also becomes part of who we are in a relationship. So I talk about our individual development because it's important in the context of relationships. All of the factors contribute to what our personality is and our role in relationships. And let me give you two examples of two people that I have worked with and currently working with, and how their early environment affects their relationships. One guy I will call, his name is Tom, and he grew up, he's about 50 years old now. He grew up in a very abusive home. He was the youngest of 4 boys, and as he terms it, his father would hit first, ask questions later. His mother was unapproachable and incredibly crabby throughout her life. Even as the boys grew up, she never had any kind or soft words for them, and completely unapproachable. What he learned about the world, and the boys themselves, sometimes an environment like that will make the 4 boys pull together, and it did the opposite. It made them also very competitive and aggressive. So my client learns the world is a bad place. You gotta watch everything. People will persecute you if you give them any room at all. He also learned that he can't trust anyone because being the youngest of those 4 boys, the 4 boys being very aggressive, by the time he got to grade school and high school, it was already determined by the teachers and his environment around him that, oh, he's one of those boys. And his reputation was already set. So when he makes friendships now, which he doesn't have very many of, he wonders, what are they after? If somebody's nice to him, he will wonder, what do they want from me? What are they after? He's not able to see the reciprocity in a friendship. So in that particular example, you can see how a person's childhood truly affects whether or not they can form relationships as an adult. Another client that I work with is a woman about 40 years old. She's the mom of 4 kids, and she grew up in a single family household, and her mother was not a well-functioning mom. And my client remembers at the age of 8 having to worry about whether or not the rent was going to get paid and hiding money underneath her pillow because she knew that if she didn't hide it, by the 25th of the month there would be no money left for food. So she would hide money throughout the month so that at the end of the month when there wasn't any money, she could go get a loaf of bread and some meat to feed her siblings. So she grew up with the sense that she had to watch everything. And she's very hypervigilant now. She's the mother of 4, and she watches everything. She believes in perfection, and it's driving. She came to see me because she's driving herself crazy. And just the idea that you don't have to be perfect was truly a new thought for her. And in her relationships with her girlfriends, and she has many friends, but she is the caretaker in those relationships. She's the one everybody goes to for advice. She feels she has to be on top of her game all the time. She has to be the parent all the time. And those friendships then either disappear if she has a friendship with someone and that person doesn't have a problem, they don't necessarily have a whole lot to share. So her relationships are built on that caretaker role. And she doesn't know how to do anything differently. So we're working on that. But you can see how early childhood affects your relationships. And it's something that you want to kind of understand about yourself as well. We first learn about ourselves in relationships from our childhood relationships and our adolescent relationships. And those relationships are fraught with so many obstacles anyway. You know, we're full of hormones, we've got insecurities, we've got peer pressure, we have family pressure, we have identity issues, we're a mess. And so we try and make relationships with other people who are also dealing with all of these issues, and we learn about ourselves, especially women, in the context of those relationships. As young people also, and you may see this in your junior high and high school kids if you have them, as kids, our emotions are right under our skin. We really have not learned to manage our emotions. So you will see junior high school kids and high school kids who are, when they're happy, they are jumping, hitting the lights, hitting the ceiling, happy, and they demonstrate their emotions. When they are sad, they're crying, the world is falling apart, the sky is falling. It's terrible because they're learning to manage their emotions, but until they learn to do that, in fact, everything is just drama. And so, thank goodness, as we pass through some of the milestones in our relationships, we learn to manage those. We learn to temper and manage our own emotions so that they're not right there on the surface and we're not impulsive. We learn about ourselves and we learn about others in those relationships. We watch other relationships. We watch our parents and their relationship. We watch our siblings in their friendships with other people. We watch our classmates. And we learn about relationships and we start to figure out in our head what type of relationship we want. What am I comfortable in? What do I want from my friends? So on top of all those variables I already mentioned, we also have to add one thing that I think is probably the biggest contributor to relationships, to female relationships especially, is societal pressures. We have unbelievable pressures that are just simply inherent in our world. And how we learn to manage those, if we learn to manage those, plays a big role in our relationships. Even if no family pressure exists, inherently there is societal pressure. And with this factor, we learn a certain level of competitiveness. Women do. Men do too. But we express it differently. But this competitiveness, we're taught as kids, do your best. From the minute we go to preschool, do your best, do your best. And that's not a bad message. It's a good message. You want our kids to do the best. We wanted to do the best. But somehow that also gets wrapped up in, am I better than she is? Is my grade better? Did I do better than this? I have to be the top of the class. So there's those types of pressures. Competition plays a large role in our relationships as well. Somehow it filters in. We become a little bit more competitive because it has become part of who we are. How we learn to understand the role that competition plays in ourselves also plays a role in our relationships. Okay? We all understand and we tolerate pressures differently. Some of us can handle a whole lot of pressure. Having 6, 7, 8, 9 kids is just, schedule it and you're just fine. Some people overwhelmed by that. I would be overwhelmed by 3. Okay, so, and then we all understand and tolerate pressures differently. We have to learn to understand what our threshold is. What are we comfortable with? Societal pressures for women have evolved over time and they have changed over time. Expectations, in my judgment, and I've been around for a while, have exponentially grown. We are, in the 1950s, my mom's role was actually quite clear. You stay home, you raise the kids. If you did some volunteer work, that was really extraordinary. Most people did not. They stayed home. They didn't even have a car. As the decades have gone by, expectations for us have changed. I don't know that we've done ourselves a big favor sometimes by the expectation that we are a career person with high achievement, that we're the best mom that we can be, that we are really the best wife ever, and that we should be the best friends and the best daughters ever. And so all of those pressures really play into who we are and in our relationships. We see other people in the competitive piece. We see our friends. Oh, she's a better daughter than I am. Oh, got to step that up. I start to feel bad about myself. The relationship suffers between us. So we always have to pay attention to what we are thinking and feeling in the context of these. What's my role in this relationship? So all of these individual factors contribute to who we are in a relationship. And I realize that I'm talking a lot about individuals, but actually we're the only ones that we can do anything about. We can't do a whole lot. We can't change other people. So we have to understand ourselves in the context of relationships. When female relationships initially start, it's usually because we share a common interest. Either we're in the same class together, we share the same activity, or our kids are in the same class, or they share an activity. So friendships are formed initially because you're interested in something I'm interested in. But as that friendship matures over time, we begin to learn more about that friend. We begin to learn other places where we like each other and where we have things in common. But then we also learn where we don't have things in common and things are different between us. But because the friendship has a broad base, or there's enough things that you like about a person, you learn to tolerate those things that are different in our friends. And you learn to tolerate the fact that some person might be a Democrat and some person might be a Republican. Maybe, maybe not. But we learn to tolerate some of those differences. And the thing I want you to remember, and if nothing else, is that friendships...
We just got a whole bunch of these little yogurt squeeze bottles. You know what they are? And they're good until 13. So is that something you guys would take home with you? Sure. Okay, I'm going to just put some out here, and if there's not enough, come back to the food shelf and get more.
Okay. Oh, that's very sweet of you.
They're really good stuff. Not for me personally.
Kids would love them. Oh, that's very nice. Very nice. Good relationships require a real solid investment, and sometimes they're not easy. Sometimes they're not easy at all. Friendships change over time. We change over time. So somebody that we met in high school is still your friend when you're 25, but sometimes your lives can be completely different and in different places. You could have a friend who's a career person, travels all over, and the idea of having a family is not necessarily on her radar right now. And it takes a little bit more work to find those things that you have in common. And so as we change, our relationships change. We may begin to experience difficulties in relationships because we're in different places in our lives, and sometimes relationships suffer difficulties because of other factors. And 4 prominent factors typically play a role when friendships have difficulties. First one is trust violations. We've all been hurt by people who have said something behind our back or betrayed us in some way that we felt was a betrayal of our trust. The second one, not respecting boundaries. In all healthy friendships and relationships, even the very best of friendships, there need to be some types of personal boundaries. And we need to respect the boundaries of our friends, and we also need to set up our own personal boundaries of what we can tolerate. That actually makes a very healthy friendship. There are some girls and women who think that a really, really good friend, you share your entire life, absolutely everything, nothing's a secret, and nothing is unsaid. And in fact, a healthier, more mature relationship has some healthy boundaries around it. When those are not respected, then sometimes there are problems in the relationship. The third thing, when friends expect too much from you or too little from you, or when you don't give enough, or when you give too little or too much. And sometimes that's a boundary issue as well. But friendships tend to work so much better when the relationship is reciprocal. So when you find, thanks Kate, you bet, nice to meet you. You too. So when you find, for example, that one of the clients that I work with, she's always the caretaker. And so in that relationship, sometimes resentments or bitterness come into the picture because you're always in a set role and there's not a whole lot of reciprocity. So relationships fall apart after a certain period of time.